What should have been a routine parking violation quickly spiraled into something much more explosive. A simple traffic stop that would expose years of hidden prejudice and shake an entire police department to its core. But what this officer didn't know was that the woman behind the wheel held the power to change everything. He thought he understood about authority and accountability. This story takes a shocking turn that no one saw coming, revealing the true cost of assumptions and the price of unchecked bias. The sun blazed overhead in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. Office workers hurried along the sidewalks, their heels clicking against the hot pavement as they rushed to lunch meetings and afternoon appointments. The city hummed with its usual midday energy, a symphony of car horns, distant construction, and the steady thrum of urban life. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat in his patrol car, parked strategically at the corner of Central Avenue and Washington Street. His eyes scanned the street methodically, looking for any sign of trouble or traffic violations. At 32, Mitchell had been with the Phoenix Police Department for 8 years, long enough to develop what he considered a keen eye for spotting problems before they escalated. He adjusted his aviator sunglasses and took a sip from his coffee cup, the bitter liquid already lukewarm in the desert heat. The radio crackled occasionally with routine calls, but the afternoon had been relatively quiet. Mitchell preferred it that way. Less chaos meant more time to focus on the details, to catch the small violations that other officers might miss. His gaze drifted toward the municipal building across the street, its glass facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. City Hall stood like a monument to bureaucracy, its parking spaces always filled with expensive cars belonging to politicians and department heads. Mitchell had always found it amusing how the people who made the rules seemed to think they were above them. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days enforcing laws created by people who lived in a completely different world than the one he patrolled in. While he dealt with drug dealers, domestic violence calls, and traffic violations, the politician sat in air-conditioned offices, making decisions that affected his daily work, but rarely reflected the reality of life on the streets. Mitchell's father had been a police officer too, working the same beats in Phoenix for 30 years, before retiring with a pension and a collection of stories about how much the job had changed. Used to be simpler, his father would say, during their monthly dinners. People respected the badge. Now everyone's got a camera and an opinion. The elder Mitchell had raised his son to believe in the nobility of police work, to see it as a calling rather than just a job. "We're the thin blue line," he would tell young Ryan, "the only thing standing between order and chaos." It was a philosophy that had shaped Mitchell's entire approach to law enforcement, giving him a sense of purpose and righteousness that had carried him through 8 years of patrol duty. But lately Mitchell had begun to question some of the assumptions that had guided his career. The department had been under increased scrutiny from community groups and the media, with calls for reform and accountability growing louder each year. Chief Green held regular meetings about community relations and cultural sensitivity, topics that hadn't been part of police training when Mitchell first joined the force. A flash of movement caught his attention. A sleek black Mercedes-Benz sedan pulled into a parking space directly in front of the municipal building. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he watched the driver, a black woman in her early 40s, step out of the vehicle. She wore a professional navy blue suit and carried herself with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. The woman paused to check her phone, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder. She moved with the kind of purposeful efficiency that Mitchell associated with people who had important places to be and important things to do. Her hair was styled in a neat bob, and her makeup was flawless despite the heat. Everything about her appearance suggested success and sophistication. Mitchell glanced at his watch and then at the parking meter beside the Mercedes. From his vantage point, he could see that the woman hadn't fed the meter, and she was walking away from her car with purpose, as if she had important business inside the building. The meter displayed a red expired message, clearly visible even from across the street. Typical, Mitchell muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He had seen this scenario countless times before. People who thought they could park wherever they wanted, ignore the rules, and walk away without consequences. It didn't matter if they were wearing expensive suits or driving luxury cars. The law was the law, and it applied to everyone equally. Mitchell had written hundreds of parking tickets over the years, and he had developed a philosophy about them. Parking regulations weren't just arbitrary rules designed to generate revenue for the city. They were part of the social contract that kept urban life functioning. When people ignored parking meters, they were essentially saying that their time was more valuable than everyone else's, that the rules didn't apply to them. He watched as the woman disappeared through the revolving doors of City Hall, her heels echoing against the marble floor of the lobby. Mitchell waited a few more minutes, his eyes fixed on the Mercedes. No coins went into the meter, and no parking permit appeared on the dashboard. Nothing. The longer he waited, the more certain Mitchell became that this was exactly the kind of entitled behavior that drove him crazy. He had grown up in a working-class family where rules mattered, where you didn't take shortcuts or expect special treatment. His father had taught him that character was revealed in how you behaved when no one was watching. And this woman clearly thought no one was watching. Mitchell thought about his own financial situation, how he had to budget carefully to make ends meet. On a police officer's salary, he drove a 10-year-old pickup truck and shopped at discount stores, while people like this woman drove luxury cars and apparently believed they were above the same rules that everyone else had to follow. With a satisfied grunt, Mitchell started his patrol car and pulled across the street. He parked behind the Mercedes, studying the vehicle more closely. The car was immaculate, its black paint job gleaming under the harsh Arizona sun. The license plate was standard issue, nothing special or distinctive that would indicate any kind of official business. Mitchell stepped out of his patrol car, his leather boots hitting the pavement with authority. He walked around the Mercedes, noting every detail. The interior was spotless, with tan leather seats and what appeared to be high-end electronics. The car probably cost more than Mitchell made in a year, yet another reminder of the economic divide that separated him from the people he was sworn to protect and serve. He pulled out his citation book and began filling out the parking ticket. The pen felt familiar in his hand as he wrote down the license plate number, the make and model of the vehicle, and the violation. "Failure to pay for the parking meter," he wrote in his neat handwriting. "Fine, $75. As he worked, Mitchell couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of entitled behavior that drove him crazy. People who drove luxury cars and wore expensive suits, thinking they could ignore the same rules that everyone else had to follow. Well, not on his watch. The parking fine was substantial. $75 represented a significant expense for most people, though Mitchell suspected that someone who drove a Mercedes wouldn't be too concerned about the cost. Still, it was the principle that mattered. Laws were laws, and they applied to everyone equally, regardless of their economic status or social position. Mitchell remembered a conversation he'd had with his partner, Officer Steve Tyler Reed, about the psychology of parking violations. "Rich people think they can buy their way out of anything," Tyler Reed had said. "They park in handicapped spaces, they ignore meters, they double park wherever they want. To them, a parking ticket is just the cost of convenience." The observation had stuck with Mitchell because it seemed to capture something essential about the relationship between wealth and accountability. People with money didn't just have more material possessions. They seemed to have a different relationship with rules and consequences. They lived in a world where problems could be solved with money, where violations were just another expense to be absorbed. He tucked the citation book back into his belt and walked to the front of the Mercedes, ready to place the ticket on the windshield. The sun reflected off the car's hood, creating a blinding glare that made him squint despite his sunglasses. He lifted the windshield wiper and slid the bright yellow ticket underneath, making sure it was clearly visible. "There we go," Mitchell said to himself, stepping back to admire his work. The ticket stood out like a beacon against the dark glass, impossible to miss. He imagined the woman's face when she returned to find it, the indignation and anger that would inevitably follow. People like her always acted shocked when they faced consequences for their actions. Mitchell was about to return to his patrol car when he noticed something that made him pause. A small, discreet emblem on the back of the Mercedes that he hadn't seen before. It was partially obscured by the car's rear bumper, but as he bent down to get a better look, his stomach began to churn. The emblem was the official seal of the city of Phoenix. Mitchell's confident smirk faltered. He looked again, squinting against the sun's glare. There it was, clear as day. The distinctive phoenix bird rising from flames, surrounded by the words City of Phoenix, Arizona. His mouth went dry as the implications began to sink in. "Oh, shit," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the street noise. He quickly looked around, hoping no one had noticed his mistake. The sidewalk was busy with pedestrians, but no one seemed to be paying attention to him or the Mercedes. Still, panic began to creep up his spine. If this was an official city vehicle, he had just made a serious error. Mitchell's mind raced through the possibilities. City vehicles were typically exempt from parking meters when conducting official business. The emblem suggested that this car belonged to a high-ranking city official, someone with the authority to park in municipal spaces without feeding meters. He had been so focused on what he perceived as entitled behavior that he hadn't taken the time to thoroughly examine the vehicle. The training he'd received at the academy came flooding back to him. Officers were supposed to be observant, to notice details that others might miss. But in his eagerness to write a ticket for what he saw as a clear violation, he had failed to follow his own protocols. It was a rookie mistake, the kind of oversight that could have serious consequences. Mitchell fumbled for his citation book, his hands suddenly unsteady. Maybe he could void the ticket, claim it was a mistake, but even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was too late. The ticket was already on the windshield, visible to anyone who walked by. If he tried to remove it now, it would only draw more attention. The heat of the Arizona sun seemed to intensify, making Mitchell's uniform feel heavy and uncomfortable. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning he'd enjoyed in his patrol car just minutes earlier. He stood frozen beside the Mercedes, his mind racing through the possibilities of what might happen next. He stood frozen beside the Mercedes, his mind racing through the possibilities. Who drove official city vehicles? Department heads, maybe the city manager, possibly even... The thought hit him like a physical blow. The mayor. Could this be the mayor's car? Mitchell's training kicked in and he tried to rationalize the situation. Just because the car had a city emblem didn't mean it belonged to the mayor. It could be any number of city officials. And besides, if it was an official vehicle, it should have had proper parking permits or government plates. The rules were the rules, regardless of who was driving. But even as he tried to convince himself, doubt gnawed at him. He had been so focused on what he perceived as entitled behavior that he hadn't taken the time to thoroughly examine the vehicle. It was a rookie mistake, the kind of oversight that could have serious consequences. Mitchell pulled out his phone and quickly searched for information about city vehicle policies. The results were not encouraging. City officials were indeed authorized to park in municipal spaces without paying meters when conducting official business. The emblem on the Mercedes was apparently sufficient identification for such purposes. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He had been so convinced that he was enforcing the law against someone who thought they were above it, when in reality, he had been the one who was wrong. The woman had been legally parked, and he had issued a citation based on his own assumptions and biases. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on Mitchell's shoulders, but he felt cold sweat beading on his forehead. He needed to think, to figure out how to handle this situation before it spiraled out of control. But as he stood there, paralyzed by indecision, he failed to notice the figure approaching from behind. "Excuse me, officer." The voice was calm, professional, and unmistakably female. Mitchell spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. Standing before him was the same woman he had watched enter City Hall, her navy blue suit impeccable despite the heat. But now he could see her more clearly, and recognition hit him like a thunderbolt. Councilwoman Danielle Harris. He had seen her face countless times in the local news, at press conferences, and in the newspaper. She was one of the most prominent figures in Phoenix politics, known for her advocacy on police reform and community relations. And Mitchell had just ticketed her car. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Harris wasn't just any city official. She was one of the most vocal critics of police practices in the city. She had been pushing for reforms, calling for better training, and advocating for increased accountability in law enforcement. And now Mitchell had handed her a perfect example of exactly the kind of behavior she had been criticizing. Mitchell's mind flashed back to recent news stories about Harris's work on police reform. She had been particularly vocal about the need for officers to examine their own biases and assumptions. Just last month, she gave a speech at the city council meeting about the importance of fair and impartial policing. Mitchell had watched part of it on the local news, rolling his eyes at what he had seen as political posturing. "Is there a problem with my vehicle?" Harris asked, her tone polite but with an underlying edge that made Mitchell's stomach drop. Mitchell stammered, his usual confidence completely abandoned. There was a parking violation." Harris's eyebrows rose slightly as she noticed the bright yellow ticket on her windshield. She walked over to examine it, her movements deliberate and controlled. Mitchell watched in horror as she carefully lifted the windshield wiper and removed the citation. "A parking violation," she repeated, reading the ticket, "for failure to pay the meter." The way she said it made Mitchell's blood run cold. There was no anger in her voice, no indignation or outrage, just a calm, measured tone that suggested she was processing information and drawing conclusions. Somehow that was worse than if she had been screaming at him. "Yes, ma'am," Mitchell managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought the meter wasn't." Harris looked up from the ticket, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no anger in her expression, but something far worse. Disappointment. "Officer Mitchell," she said, reading his name tag. "Do you see this emblem on my vehicle?" Mitchell nodded miserably, unable to trust his voice. He felt like a child being scolded by a teacher, exposed and ashamed of his mistake. "And do you know what this emblem represents?" "The city of Phoenix," Mitchell replied, his words coming out in a rush. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize," Harris interrupted, her voice still calm but with steel underneath. "You saw a black woman in an expensive car, and you assumed she was breaking the rules. You didn't bother to check if there might be a legitimate reason for the parking arrangement. You simply saw what you expected to see." The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow because he knew they were true. He had made assumptions based on appearances, and those assumptions had been wrong. He had been so focused on what he perceived as entitled behavior that he hadn't taken the time to gather all the facts. Mitchell's face burned with shame and embarrassment. He wanted to protest, to explain that it wasn't about race, that he would have ticketed anyone who parked without paying the meter. But the words died in his throat because deep down, he knew she was right. He had made assumptions based on appearances, and those assumptions had been wrong. "Ma'am, I apologize," Mitchell said, his voice barely audible. "I made a mistake. I can void the ticket right now." Harris studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You can void the ticket, Officer Mitchell, but can you void the assumptions that led to it being written in the first place?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Mitchell felt exposed, as if all his unconscious biases were suddenly visible for the world to see. He had always prided himself on being a fair and impartial officer, but now he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that his perception of fairness might not be as objective as he had believed. I don't know," Mitchell admitted, his voice cracking slightly. The honesty in his response seemed to surprise Harris. She had expected defensiveness, excuses, or denial. Instead, she found herself facing an officer who appeared genuinely shaken by his own mistake. Harris nodded slowly, as if his honesty was exactly what she had expected. "At least you're honest about it. That's more than most people are willing to be." She folded the ticket carefully and slipped it into her purse. "I'm going to keep this, Officer Mitchell, not because I intend to pay for it, but because it serves as a reminder of why the work I do is so important." Mitchell watched in stunned silence as Harris walked back toward City Hall. Her heels clicked against the pavement with the same confidence she had displayed earlier, but now each step felt like a judgment against him. He wanted to call out to her, to apologize again, to somehow make things right. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to undo what had just happened. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Mitchell stood alone beside the Mercedes, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like the oppressive Arizona heat. He felt as though everyone on the street was watching him, judging him, seeing him for what he really was, rather than what he had always believed himself to be. As Harris disappeared through the revolving doors of City Hall, Mitchell stood alone beside her Mercedes, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like the oppressive Arizona heat. He had always believed that he was a good cop, someone who treated everyone fairly regardless of their background, but now he was forced to confront the possibility that his definition of fairness might be narrower than he had ever imagined. The radio in his patrol car crackled to life, dispatching another unit to a domestic disturbance across town. Normal police work, the kind of calls that Mitchell had handled hundreds of times before. But as he walked back to his car, everything felt different. The familiar weight of his badge, the comfortable routine of patrol, the certainty that he was on the right side of justice, all of it seemed suddenly fragile and uncertain. Mitchell slid behind the wheel of his patrol car, his hands trembling as he reached for the radio. He should report the incident, explain what had happened, and face whatever consequences might follow. But as he lifted the radio to his lips, he hesitated. How could he possibly explain the complexity of what had just occurred? How could he convey the shame and confusion he felt without sounding like he was making excuses? The weight of the moment settled on him like a heavy blanket. He had joined the police force to serve and protect, to make a difference in his community. But now he was forced to confront the possibility that his own biases and assumptions might be undermining that mission. The woman he had just encountered wasn't just any citizen. She was someone who had dedicated her career to addressing exactly the kind of behavior he had just exhibited. Instead, he set the radio down and sat in silence, staring at the municipal building where Councilwoman Harris had disappeared. The sun continued to beat down mercilessly, but Mitchell felt cold inside, as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. His phone buzzed with a text message from his partner, Tyler Reed. "Everything okay? You've been off the radio for a while." Mitchell stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he tell his partner that he had just made one of the most embarrassing mistakes of his career? He typed back, "All good. Just handling a parking situation." It was technically true, but it felt like a lie. The parking situation had been so much more than that. It had been a mirror held up to his own assumptions and biases, reflecting back an image of himself that he didn't want to see. Mitchell started his patrol car and pulled away from City Hall, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving behind more than just a parking space. He was leaving behind a version of himself that he had always believed to be fair and impartial, replaced by someone who had to confront the uncomfortable truth that his perceptions might be clouded by unconscious bias. Inside City Hall, Danielle Harris walked through the marble-lined corridors with purpose, her heels echoing off the high ceilings. She had been on her way to a meeting with the city manager when the incident with Officer Mitchell occurred, but now her priorities had shifted. The parking ticket, folded neatly in her purse, represented more than just a simple mistake. It was a symptom of a deeper problem that she had been fighting against for years. Harris had entered politics after a successful career in law, motivated by a desire to address the inequalities and injustices that she had witnessed in the legal system. She had seen how unconscious bias could affect everything from sentencing decisions to police interactions, and she had made it her mission to bring these issues to light. The encounter with Officer Mitchell was not her first experience with biased policing, but it was perhaps the most clear-cut example she had encountered. The officer's assumptions had been laid bare in a way that left no room for debate or interpretation. He had seen a black woman in an expensive car and assumed she was breaking the rules, without taking the time to gather all the facts. Harris's office was on the third floor, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of downtown Phoenix. The walls were lined with awards and photographs from her years of public service, including pictures with community leaders, police chiefs, and fellow politicians. Her desk was immaculate, organized with the precision of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and failure. She sat down at her desk and pulled out the parking ticket, studying it once more. Officer Ryan Mitchell. The name wasn't familiar, but she made a mental note to look into his record. How many other similar incidents had he been involved in? How many other people had been subjected to the same kind of biased assumptions? Harris had been working on police reform for years, pushing for better training, increased accountability, and more diverse recruitment. But progress had been slow, hampered by resistance from within the department and skepticism from some community members who doubted that meaningful change was possible. The parking ticket incident, however, presented an opportunity. It was a clear, documented example of the kind of unconscious bias that she had been trying to address. More importantly, Officer Mitchell's apparent willingness to acknowledge his mistake suggested that he might be open to learning and growth. Harris reached for her phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Chief Green speaking. Chief, it's Danielle Harris. I need to speak with you about one of your officers. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Chief Ronald Green had been with the Phoenix Police Department for 25 years, working his way up from patrol officer to his current position. He and Harris had a professional relationship built on mutual respect, but also frequent disagreements about police reform and community relations. Green was practical. He knew things needed to change, but he also wanted to look out for his officers. He had seen too many good cops crucified in the media for honest mistakes, and he was always cautious about how complaints against his officers were handled. What happened? Green asked, his tone cautious. Harris recounted the incident in detail, her voice calm and professional. She didn't embellish or dramatize the events, simply stated the facts as they had occurred. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I see," Green said finally. "And you're certain that Officer Mitchell could see the city emblem on your vehicle?" "It's possible he missed it initially," Harris conceded. "But the larger issue isn't about the emblem or the parking violation. It's about the assumptions that led to the ticket being written in the first place." Green sighed, a sound that conveyed years of dealing with similar situations. "Danielle, I understand your concerns, but officers write hundreds of parking tickets every week. Sometimes mistakes happen. It doesn't necessarily mean—" "Ronald," Harris interrupted, using his first name to emphasize the seriousness of the conversation. "We both know this isn't about a simple mistake. This is about a pattern of behavior that we've discussed many times before. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Green knew exactly what she was referring to. The department had been collecting data on traffic stops and citations for the past 2 years, and the numbers showed disturbing disparities in how officers treated different demographic groups. Black and Latino drivers were stopped more frequently, searched more often, and cited at higher rates than white drivers, even when controlling for other factors. The data was damning, but Green had been reluctant to take aggressive action without clear evidence of intentional discrimination. He knew that most of his officers were good people who didn't consciously harbor racist attitudes. But the statistics suggested that unconscious bias was still influencing their decisions. Another pause. Green was a good cop and a decent man, but he was also protective of his officers. The balance between supporting his department and addressing legitimate concerns about bias was a constant challenge. "I'll speak with Officer Mitchell," Green said finally. "Review his record, see if there are any other incidents that might indicate a pattern." "That's a start," Harris replied, "but I think we need to go deeper than that. This incident, combined with the data we've been collecting about traffic stops and citations, suggests that we have a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution." Green knew what she was leading up to. For months, Harris had been pushing for mandatory bias training for all officers, enhanced data collection on police interactions, and the implementation of body cameras for patrol units. The department had resisted these changes, citing budget concerns and questioning their effectiveness. "Danielle, you know the challenges we're facing with budget constraints and staffing shortages. Major policy changes take time to implement, and we need to be sure that any changes we make are actually effective." "And while we're taking our time to study and debate," Harris replied, "how many more incidents like this are occurring? How many more people are being treated unfairly because of unconscious bias or outright prejudice?" The conversation continued for several more minutes, with both sides restating their positions. Green promised to investigate the incident thoroughly and to consider Harris's recommendations for broader reforms. Harris, for her part, made it clear that she would be monitoring the situation closely and that she expected concrete action, not just empty promises. Harris understood the political realities that Green faced. Police departments were under increasing scrutiny from both the public and the media, and any admission of bias or discrimination could have serious consequences. But she also knew that avoiding the issue would only make it worse in the long run. "Ronald, I want to be clear about something," Harris said as the conversation neared its end. "This isn't about destroying Officer Mitchell's career or embarrassing the department. It's about addressing a problem that's undermining the relationship between police and the community. We can either deal with this proactively, or we can wait for it to explode in our faces." Green appreciated her directness. Too many politicians spoke in coded language, making it difficult to understand their real intentions. Harris's approach, was refreshingly honest, even when it made his job more difficult. "I understand your position," Green replied. "Give me a week to review Officer Mitchell's record and discuss the situation with his supervisors. Then we can talk about next steps." "I appreciate that, Chief, and I hope you'll consider the broader implications of what happened today. This incident is an opportunity to address these issues before they become bigger problems." After hanging up, Harris sat back in her chair and looked out at the city sprawling beyond her window. Phoenix was a diverse metropolis, home to people from dozens of different backgrounds and cultures. But despite its diversity, the city still struggled with issues of inequality and bias, particularly in its interactions between law enforcement and communities of color. The parking ticket incident was minor in the grand scheme of things, but Harris knew that it represented something much larger. It was a microcosm of the daily indignities and assumptions that many people faced simply because of their race or appearance. And if someone in her position, with her credentials and status, could be subjected to such treatment, what did that say about the experiences of ordinary citizens? Harris pulled out her laptop and began drafting a memo to the other city council members about the incident. She wouldn't name Officer Mitchell specifically, but she would use the example to illustrate the need for comprehensive police reform. The memo would be carefully worded to avoid inflammatory language while still conveying the seriousness of the situation. As she worked, Harris thought about the officer's reaction when she had confronted him. He had been embarrassed and defensive, but he had also seemed genuinely shaken by his mistake. That gave her hope that he might be open to learning and growth. Unlike some officers who doubled down on their biases when confronted with evidence of their mistakes. Harris's phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant, reminding her about the meeting with the city manager. She glanced at her watch and realized that she was already running late. The discussion about budget allocations and municipal priorities would have to wait. She had more pressing concerns to address. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Mitchell sat in his patrol car, still parked on the street outside City Hall. He had been staring at the municipal building for nearly an hour, lost in thought about the encounter with Councilwoman Harris. The initial shock and embarrassment had begun to fade, replaced by a deeper sense of unease about what the incident revealed about his own attitudes and assumptions. Mitchell pulled out his phone and began searching for information about Councilwoman Harris. The results were extensive. She had been involved in Phoenix politics for over a decade, serving on various committees and boards before being elected to the city council. Her biography listed numerous awards and achievements, including recognition for her work on civil rights and community relations. As he read, Mitchell began to understand the full scope of his mistake. This wasn't just any city official he had ticketed. It was someone who had dedicated her career to addressing exactly the kind of behavior he had just exhibited. The irony was almost overwhelming. Mitchell prided himself on being a fair and professional officer. He had never considered himself prejudiced or biased, and he had always believed that he treated all citizens with equal respect and dignity. But Harris's words had forced him to confront the possibility that his perception of his own fairness might not align with reality. He thought back to his training at the police academy, where instructors had emphasized the importance of treating all citizens with respect and dignity. They had covered topics like cultural sensitivity and community relations, but those lessons had always seemed abstract and theoretical. Now, faced with a concrete example of his own bias, Mitchell realized that he had been operating with blind spots that he had never acknowledged. The more Mitchell thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. He had always believed that racism was something overt and intentional, the kind of behavior exhibited by people who used racial slurs or openly discriminated against others. But Harris's words had suggested that bias could be more subtle, more unconscious, and more pervasive than he had ever imagined. He thought back to other traffic stops and citations he had issued over the years. How many times had he made similar assumptions based on appearance or circumstances? How many times had he seen what he expected to see rather than what was actually there? The questions were uncomfortable, but Mitchell knew he needed to confront them honestly if he wanted to be the kind of officer he had always believed himself to be. The radio crackled with another call, this one closer to his current location. A fender bender at the intersection of Indian School Road and Central Avenue. Mitchell acknowledged the call and put his patrol car in gear, grateful for the distraction from his troubled thoughts. As he drove toward the accident scene, Mitchell's mind continued to churn. He had been trained to make quick decisions based on limited information, to assess situations rapidly and respond accordingly. But what if those same skills that made him effective in emergency situations were also leading him to make unfair judgments about people who posed no threat at all? The accident scene was typical of Phoenix traffic incidents. 2 vehicles with minor damage, drivers arguing about who was at fault, and a small crowd of onlookers eager to share their opinions about what had happened. Mitchell approached the scene with his usual professional demeanor, but he found himself paying closer attention to his own thought processes as he interacted with the drivers. One driver was a young Latino man in work clothes driving an older pickup truck. The other was a middle-aged white woman in a newer sedan. Mitchell noticed that his initial instinct was to assume that the younger driver was at fault, based on nothing more than age and appearance. The realization was jarring, and he made a conscious effort to gather all the facts before making any judgments. The investigation revealed that the woman had been texting while driving and had rear-ended the pickup truck when traffic stopped suddenly. The young man had been driving responsibly and was not at fault. Mitchell issued the appropriate citation and filed his report. But the incident left him even more unsettled about his own biases and assumptions. As he completed the paperwork, Mitchell couldn't help but wonder how many other situations he had misjudged based on unconscious bias. How many times had he assumed criminality or fault based on appearance rather than evidence? The questions were deeply troubling, but they also represented the first step toward self-awareness and growth. The rest of Mitchell's shift passed in a blur of routine calls and paperwork, but the encounter with Councilwoman Harris remained at the forefront of his mind, a persistent reminder that his understanding of fairness and justice might be more limited than he had ever imagined. When his shift ended, Mitchell didn't go home immediately. Instead, he drove to a quiet park on the outskirts of Phoenix, where he often went to think and decompress after difficult days. The sun was setting over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the horizon, their arms raised toward the darkening sky. Mitchell sat on a bench overlooking the desert, his uniform still crisp despite the heat of the day. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through news articles about police bias and community relations. The stories were sobering, filled with accounts of officers who had made similar mistakes to his own, and communities that had lost trust in law enforcement because of repeated incidents of unfair treatment. One article particularly caught his attention. It was about a police department in California that had implemented comprehensive bias training for all officers, along with new policies for data collection and accountability. The results had been promising, with significant reductions in complaints against officers and improvements in community relations. The article described how the department had partnered with local universities and community organizations to develop training programs that addressed unconscious bias and cultural competency. The training wasn't just about avoiding lawsuits or political correctness. It was about helping officers become more effective at their jobs by improving their ability to read situations accurately and interact fairly with all members of the community. Mitchell found himself wondering if similar training might be available in Phoenix. The idea of admitting that he needed help with bias was uncomfortable, but the alternative, continuing to operate with blind spots that could harm his career and, more importantly, the people he was sworn to protect, seemed far worse. As darkness fell over the desert, Mitchell finally drove home to his small apartment in a middle-class neighborhood on the east side of Phoenix. The building was typical of the area, one-story stucco construction with a red tile roof, surrounded by gravel landscaping and desert plants. He had lived there for 3 years, long enough to get to know his neighbors, but not long enough to feel truly settled. The apartment was neat and Spartan, reflecting Mitchell's military background and practical nature. A few family photos sat on the bookshelf, including one of him with his father on graduation day from the police academy. The older Mitchell wore his dress uniform with obvious pride, his arm around his son's shoulder as they both smiled at the camera. Mitchell poured himself a beer and sat down at his small kitchen table where he kept his laptop. He opened the computer and began searching for information about bias training programs for law enforcement. The results were extensive, with programs offered by universities, police academies, and private organizations specializing in cultural competency and community relations. One program particularly caught his attention. It was offered by Arizona State University in partnership with the Phoenix Police Department, designed specifically for local officers who wanted to improve their understanding of bias and its impact on policing. The program included both online coursework and in-person workshops, with participants receiving continuing education credits that could help with career advancement. Mitchell bookmarked the website and continued reading. The program description emphasized that bias training wasn't about labeling officers as racist or prejudiced, but about helping them understand how unconscious mental shortcuts could affect their decision-making. The goal was to make officers more effective at their jobs by improving their ability to assess situations objectively and interact fairly with all members of the community. The idea of voluntarily enrolling in such a program was daunting. Mitchell knew that some of his colleagues would see it as an admission of weakness or guilt, an unnecessary capitulation to political correctness. But he also knew that the alternative, continuing to operate with blind spots that could harm his career and the people he served, was unacceptable. Mitchell's phone buzzed with a text message from his father. "How was your shift today? Anything interesting happen?" The elder Mitchell had made a habit of checking in with his son after work, partly out of parental concern and partly because he missed the daily routine of police work. Retirement had been difficult for him, leaving a void that fishing trips and volunteer work couldn't quite fill. Mitchell stared at the message, unsure how to respond. His father belonged to a generation of police officers who had operated under different rules and expectations. The elder Mitchell had always prided himself on being colorblind in his police work, treating all suspects and citizens with the same gruff professionalism. But he had also grown up in an era when discussions about unconscious bias and cultural competency were rare if they existed at all. "Just routine stuff," Mitchell typed back. "Nothing worth mentioning." It was a lie, but Mitchell couldn't bring himself to tell his father about the incident with Councilwoman Harris. Not yet, anyway. He needed time to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward before he could explain it to someone else. The next morning, Mitchell arrived at the police station 30 minutes early, hoping to speak with his supervisor before the shift briefing. Sergeant Maria Santos was a 15-year veteran of the department who had worked her way up from patrol officer to her current position. She was known for being fair but demanding, with little patience for officers who couldn't meet her standards. Santos was in her office reviewing reports from the previous night's shifts. Her desk was organized chaos, stacks of paperwork, coffee cups, and police manuals creating a controlled mess that somehow made sense to her. She looked up as Mitchell knocked on her doorframe. "Mitchell, you're early," Santos said, checking her watch. "What's on your mind?" Mitchell entered the office and closed the door behind him. "Sergeant, I need to talk to you about something that happened yesterday. I made a mistake and I want to make sure I handle it properly." Santos leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more serious. "What kind of mistake?" Mitchell recounted the incident with Councilwoman Harris, leaving out none of the details. He described his initial assumptions, the realization that he had been wrong, and the conversation that followed. Santos listened without interrupting, her face revealing nothing about her thoughts. When Mitchell finished, Santos was quiet for a long moment. She had been expecting this conversation ever since Chief Green had called her the night before to discuss the incident. Harris had been true to her word about speaking with the chief, and Green had wanted Santos to be prepared for whatever fallout might occur. "I appreciate you coming to me about this," Santos said finally. "It shows integrity, and that's important, but I have to ask, what do you think this incident says about your approach to policing?" The question was direct and uncomfortable, but Mitchell had been expecting it. He had spent most of the night thinking about exactly that issue. "I think it shows that I have blind spots I wasn't aware of," Mitchell replied. "I made assumptions based on appearance and circumstances rather than taking the time to gather all the facts. That's not the kind of officer I want to be." Santos nodded approvingly. "That's a mature response. A lot of officers would have made excuses or tried to justify their actions. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge your mistake suggests that you can learn from it." She pulled out a file from her desk drawer and opened it. "I've been reviewing your record, Mitchell. Overall, you're a good officer. Your arrest record is solid, you've had very few complaints, and your fellow officers respect you. But I want you to look at something." Santos turned her computer screen toward Mitchell, displaying a spreadsheet with data about traffic stops and citations. "This is your activity for the past 2 years. Look at the breakdown by demographics." Mitchell studied the numbers, his stomach sinking as he saw the pattern. His traffic stops showed a disproportionate number of minority drivers, and his citation rates were higher for Black and Latino drivers than for white drivers. The data was stark and undeniable. "I wasn't aware of these patterns," Mitchell said quietly. "Most officers aren't," Santos replied. "That's why we started collecting this data. Unconscious bias affects everyone, even good officers who would never intentionally discriminate. The question is, what are you going to do about it now that you're aware of it?" Mitchell looked up from the screen. "I want to get better. I want to be the kind of officer who treats everyone fairly. What would you recommend?" Santos smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd ask that. There are several options available to you. The department offers bias training, and there are external programs that might be even more comprehensive. The choice is yours, but I'd strongly recommend taking advantage of whatever resources are available." She handed Mitchell a brochure about the ASU program he had found online the night before. "This program has gotten good reviews from officers who have completed it. It's voluntary, so there's no pressure from the department. But if you're serious about improving your skills, it might be worth considering." Mitchell took the brochure, relieved that Santos seemed supportive rather than punitive. "What about the incident with Councilwoman Harris? What happens next?" "Chief Green is handling that situation," Santos replied. "You'll probably hear from him directly, but I can tell you that the fact that you came forward with this will work in your favor. It shows that you're taking responsibility and trying to learn from your mistakes. The shift briefing that morning was routine. Reports of overnight incidents, updates on ongoing investigations, and reminders about department policies. But Mitchell found it difficult to concentrate, his mind still occupied with the previous day's events and the conversation with Santos. After the briefing, Mitchell was assigned to patrol the same area where he had encountered Harris. The irony wasn't lost on him as he drove through downtown Phoenix, passing the municipal building where everything had started. The parking space where Harris's Mercedes had been parked was now occupied by a different vehicle, but the memory of his mistake remained vivid. Mitchell's first call of the day was a noise complaint at an apartment complex in a predominantly Latino neighborhood. The caller, an elderly woman, reported that her neighbors were playing music too loudly and had been unresponsive to her requests to turn it down. As Mitchell approached the apartment, he could hear the music clearly, a mix of traditional Mexican folk music and contemporary pop. The volume was indeed excessive, but Mitchell found himself paying closer attention to his own thought processes as he prepared to handle the situation. His initial instinct was to assume that the music was intentionally disrespectful, a deliberate provocation by inconsiderate neighbors. But as he knocked on the door, Mitchell forced himself to consider other possibilities. Maybe the residents didn't realize how loud their music was. Maybe they were celebrating something important. Maybe language barriers were preventing effective communication with the complainant. The door was answered by a young man in his early 20s who appeared nervous when he saw Mitchell's uniform. "Hey, un problema, official?" the man asked in Spanish. Mitchell's Spanish was limited, but he managed to communicate that there had been complaints about the music volume. The young man's face showed genuine surprise and concern. He called to others in the apartment, and soon an older woman appeared, apparently his mother. "I'm sorry, officer," the woman said in accented English. "We didn't realize the music was too loud. We are having a small celebration for my daughter's quinceañera. We will turn it down immediately." The woman's obvious distress at having caused a problem struck Mitchell deeply. She wasn't defiant or disrespectful. She was genuinely apologetic and eager to comply with the noise ordinance. Her reaction suggested that she had great respect for law enforcement and wanted to be a good neighbor. Mitchell helped mediate a conversation between the celebrating family and the complainant, discovering that the elderly woman was also Latina and had been hesitant to approach her neighbors directly due to her own shyness rather than any deliberate rudeness on their part. The situation was resolved quickly and amicably, with both parties expressing gratitude for Mitchell's assistance. As he drove away from the apartment complex, Mitchell reflected on how differently he had approached the situation compared to his usual methods. By suspending his initial assumptions and taking time to understand the perspectives of all parties involved, he had been able to resolve the conflict more effectively than if he had simply issued citations or made arrests. The next few hours of his shift passed quietly, with routine traffic stops and administrative tasks. But Mitchell found himself paying closer attention to his own decision-making processes, questioning assumptions that he had previously taken for granted. Around mid-afternoon, Mitchell received a call that made his blood run cold. A domestic disturbance at a house in an upscale neighborhood, with reports of a black woman screaming at police officers. The dispatcher noted that the caller had specifically mentioned the race of the woman involved, describing her as aggressive and out of control. Mitchell's heart raced as he drove to the scene, wondering if he was about to encounter another situation like the one with Councilwoman Harris. The address was in a neighborhood of expensive homes with manicured lawns and luxury cars in the driveways, exactly the kind of area where racial assumptions might be particularly problematic. When Mitchell arrived at the scene, he found two other officers already there, speaking with a well-dressed black woman in her 30s. The woman was clearly upset, but not aggressive. She was gesturing emphatically while speaking in a calm, professional tone. Mitchell recognized the signs of someone who was frustrated but trying to maintain their composure. "What's the situation?" Mitchell asked one of the other officers. "Neighbor called about a disturbance," Officer Parker replied. "Says this woman was screaming and causing a scene, but she seems calm enough now." Mitchell approached the woman, who looked up at him with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Mitchell. Can you tell me what happened here?" The woman took a deep breath before responding. "I'm Dr. Monique Taylor. I live here," she said, pointing to a large house behind her. "I was bringing in my groceries when my neighbor started yelling at me, accusing me of being a burglar. When I tried to explain that I live here, she called the police and said I was acting aggressively." Mitchell looked at the house Dr. Taylor had indicated, then at the luxury SUV parked in the driveway. Everything about the situation suggested that she was telling the truth, but he could see how a neighbor might make assumptions based on appearance and circumstances. "Have you spoken with the neighbor who called?" Mitchell asked Officer Parker. "She's inside," Johnson replied. "Says she's never seen this woman before and thought she was breaking in." Mitchell walked to the neighbor's house, where he found a middle-aged white woman peering nervously through her window. When she answered the door, she immediately began explaining her version of events. "I've lived here for 5 years and I've never seen that woman before," the neighbor said. "She was acting very suspicious, looking around like she was casing the place. When I asked her what she was doing, she got very aggressive and started yelling at me." Mitchell listened politely, but something about the neighbor's story didn't ring true. "Did you see her enter the house?" he asked. "Well, no," the neighbor admitted, "but she was clearly up to something. You can't be too careful these days." Mitchell thanked the neighbor and returned to Dr. Taylor, who was now showing identification to Officer Parker. Her driver's license clearly showed the address of the house in question, along with her professional credentials as a pediatric surgeon at a local hospital. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," Mitchell said. "It appears there was a misunderstanding. Your neighbor was concerned about security, but she was obviously mistaken about the situation." Dr. Taylor nodded, but Mitchell could see the anger and hurt in her eyes. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said quietly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and I'm still treated like I don't belong here." The comment hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He realized that Dr. Taylor was describing exactly the kind of bias that he had exhibited toward Councilwoman Harris. The assumption that a black woman in an upscale area must be up to something suspicious was the same kind of thinking that had led him to ticket Harris's car. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Mitchell said, meaning it sincerely. "You have every right to feel safe and welcome in your own neighborhood." Dr. Taylor looked surprised by his response. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate that." As Mitchell drove away from the scene, he felt a deep sense of shame about the incident. Not because of anything he had done wrong this time, but because he recognized how easily he could have made the same assumptions as the neighbor. The only difference was that his encounter with Harris had opened his eyes to the reality of unconscious bias. The rest of Mitchell's shift was routine, but the incident with Dr. Taylor stayed with him. He began to see patterns in his interactions with citizens that he had never noticed before. The way white drivers argued with him more freely during traffic stops, while black and Latino drivers were often more deferential and careful. The way wealthy neighborhoods expected immediate responses to minor complaints, while similar calls from poor areas were often given lower priority. When his shift ended, Mitchell drove directly to the Arizona State University campus, where he had learned that the bias training program was headquartered. The building was a modern structure with glass walls and contemporary architecture, reflecting the university's commitment to progressive education and research. The program coordinator, Dr. Laura Evans, was a former police officer who had earned a PhD in psychology and now specialized in law enforcement training. She was in her office reviewing applications from officers who wanted to enroll in the program. "Officer Mitchell," Dr. Laura Evans said, looking up from her desk. "I wasn't expecting you. How can I help you?" Mitchell had called ahead to schedule the meeting, but he was still nervous about being there. "I'm interested in learning more about your bias training program. I had an incident recently that made me realize I need to examine my own assumptions and biases." Dr. Laura Evans gestured for him to sit down. "I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to admit that we all have blind spots. Can you tell me more about what happened?" Mitchell recounted the incident with Councilwoman Harris, along with his growing awareness of patterns in his own policing that he had never noticed before. Dr. Laura Evans listened carefully, asking occasional questions to clarify details. "What you're describing is very common," Dr. Evans said when Mitchell finished. "Most officers are surprised when they first see data about their own traffic stops and citations. The human brain is wired to make quick judgments based on limited information, which can be helpful in emergency situations, but problematic when those judgments are influenced by unconscious bias." She pulled out a thick binder filled with research studies and program materials. "Our program is designed to help officers understand how bias affects decision-making and develop strategies for making more objective assessments. It's not about political correctness or guilt. It's about becoming better at your job." Mitchell flipped through the materials, impressed by the scientific rigor and practical applications. "How long is the program?" "It's a 12-week course that meets once a week for 3 hours," Dr. Laura Evans replied. "We cover topics like implicit bias, cultural competency, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. Participants also complete practical exercises and role-playing scenarios." "What's the reaction been from officers who have completed the program?" Dr. Laura Evans smiled. "Initially, there's often resistance. Nobody likes to be told they might be biased, but by the end of the program, most participants report feeling more confident in their interactions with diverse communities. They're better able to read situations accurately and respond appropriately." Mitchell made his decision. "I'd like to enroll." Dr. Laura Evans handed him an application form. "The next session starts in 2 weeks. I should warn you that the program can be challenging emotionally. You'll be forced to confront assumptions and beliefs that you might have held for years. Are you prepared for that?" Mitchell thought about Councilwoman Harris's words, about Dr. Taylor's experience in her own neighborhood, and about the data showing disparities in his own policing. "I'm ready." Over the next 2 weeks, Mitchell found himself paying closer attention to his interactions with citizens and his own thought processes. He started a journal, documenting situations where he caught himself making assumptions based on appearance or circumstances. The exercise was humbling and sometimes disturbing, but it was also enlightening. He also began researching the history of policing and race relations in Phoenix. The city had experienced significant tensions over the years, with high-profile incidents of police misconduct and ongoing disputes about immigration enforcement. Mitchell realized that he had been operating in a historical and social context that he had never fully understood. The first session of the bias training program was held on a Tuesday evening in a classroom at ASU. Mitchell arrived early, nervous about what he might encounter. The other participants were a diverse group of officers from different ranks and departments, including several women and minorities. Dr. Laura Evans began the session with a simple exercise. She asked participants to write down their first impressions of a series of photographs, people in various settings and circumstances. When they compared their responses, the patterns were striking. Most participants had made similar assumptions about the people in the photos, often based on race, age, or clothing. "This is how the human brain works," Dr. Laura Evans explained. "We make split-second judgments based on limited information. In police work, this can be helpful when assessing potential threats, but it can also lead to unfair treatment of citizens who pose no danger." The session continued with discussions about the science of bias, including research on how unconscious prejudices affect behavior. Mitchell was surprised to learn that even people who consciously rejected racist attitudes often showed bias in their actions and decisions. "The goal isn't to eliminate bias completely," Dr. Laura Evans said. "That's probably impossible. The goal is to become aware of our biases and develop strategies for making more objective decisions." One of the most powerful parts of the program was hearing from community members who had experienced biased policing. A series of speakers shared their stories describing encounters with law enforcement that had been shaped by assumptions and stereotypes. One speaker was a young black man who had been stopped multiple times while driving through affluent neighborhoods, simply because officers assumed he didn't belong there. Another was a Latina woman who had been questioned aggressively during a traffic stop, with officers assuming she was undocumented despite her obvious American citizenship. The stories were difficult to hear, but they helped Mitchell understand the real-world impact of the kind of assumptions he had made about Councilwoman Harris. He began to see how his single incident was part of a larger pattern of interactions that could damage trust between police and communities. As the program progressed, Mitchell found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He became more patient during traffic stops, taking time to listen to drivers' explanations before making decisions. He started asking more questions and making fewer assumptions about people's motivations and circumstances. The change was noticed by his colleagues. Officer Parker commented that Mitchell seemed more thoughtful and deliberate in his approach to policing. Sergeant Santos noted improvements in his report writing and citizen interactions. Even his partner, Tyler Reed, mentioned that Mitchell seemed more focused and professional. But the most significant change was in Mitchell's own sense of confidence and competence. He felt more effective at his job, better able to read situations accurately and respond appropriately. The training had given him tools for making more objective assessments and communicating more effectively with diverse communities. Halfway through the program, Mitchell received a call that tested his new skills. A traffic stop involving a young black man driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood. Exactly the kind of situation where bias might influence his decisions. The driver, Eric Thompson, was a college student at Arizona State University. He had been stopped for speeding, but Mitchell could see that he was nervous and defensive, probably expecting to be treated unfairly based on previous experiences with law enforcement. "Good evening," Mitchell said, approaching the car with a calm, professional demeanor. "I stopped you because you were traveling 38 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Do you have your license and registration?" Eric handed over his documents, his hands shaking slightly. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry about the speed. I was late for work." Mitchell examined the documents, noting that Eric had a clean driving record and was indeed enrolled at ASU. Instead of immediately writing a citation, he decided to engage the young man in conversation. "Where do you work?" Mitchell asked. "I'm a tutor at the university," Eric replied, seeming surprised by the question. "I help other students with math and science courses." Mitchell nodded, impressed by the young man's dedication to his education and helping others. That's great. Education is important. I'm going to give you a warning this time, but please be more careful about your speed. These residential streets have a lot of pedestrians and children. Eric's face showed genuine surprise and relief. Thank you, officer. I really appreciate that. As Mitchell walked back to his patrol car, he reflected on how differently he had handled the situation compared to his usual approach. Instead of making assumptions about why a young black man was driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood, he had treated Eric as an individual and made his decision based on the specific circumstances of the stop. The encounter left Mitchell feeling more confident about his abilities as a police officer. He had been able to exercise appropriate discretion while still enforcing the law, and he had interacted with a citizen in a way that built trust rather than resentment. Near the end of the bias training program, Dr. Laura Evans announced that participants would be meeting with community leaders to discuss their experiences and insights. Mitchell was nervous about the meeting, knowing that it would likely include people who had been critical of police practices. The meeting was held at a community center in a diverse neighborhood with representatives from various ethnic and racial communities. Mitchell was surprised to see Councilwoman Harris among the participants, and he felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation about possibly speaking with her again. Dr. Laura Evans facilitated the discussion, encouraging open dialogue about policing and community relations. The conversation was frank and sometimes difficult, with community members sharing their experiences and concerns, while officers explained their perspectives and challenges. Mitchell found himself speaking up more than he had expected, sharing his own journey of recognizing and addressing bias. He talked about the incident with Councilwoman Harris and how it had forced him to examine his own assumptions and prejudices. I realized that I had been making decisions based on stereotypes and assumptions rather than facts, Mitchell said. The training program helped me understand that bias isn't just about bad people making intentional choices to discriminate. It's about unconscious patterns of thinking that can affect anyone. After the formal discussion ended, Councilwoman Harris approached Mitchell. He tensed, unsure what to expect from their second encounter. "Officer Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. "I wanted to thank you for sharing your experiences tonight. It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes and work to improve." Mitchell shook her hand, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Councilwoman. I owe you an apology for what happened that day. Your words really opened my eyes to issues I had never considered." Harris smiled. "The apology is appreciated, but what's more important is what you've done since then. Taking responsibility and working to improve, that's what real accountability looks like." They talked for several more minutes, with Harris sharing her own experiences and Mitchell describing the changes he had noticed in his approach to policing. The conversation was respectful and productive, a stark contrast to their first encounter. "I hope you'll consider staying involved in these community discussions," Harris said as they prepared to leave. "We need officers who are willing to engage honestly with these issues." Mitchell nodded. "I'd like that. I think I have a lot more to learn." As he drove home that night, Mitchell reflected on the journey he had taken over the past several months. What had started as an embarrassing mistake had become an opportunity for growth and self-improvement. He felt more confident in his abilities as a police officer and more connected to the community he served. The bias training program concluded with a graduation ceremony, attended by family members, colleagues, and community leaders. Mitchell's father was there, having driven in from his retirement home in Scottsdale. The elder Mitchell had been skeptical about the program when his son first described it, but he had been impressed by the changes he had observed. "I'm proud of you, son," the elder Mitchell said after the ceremony. "It takes a real man to admit when he's wrong and work to make things right." Mitchell received his certificate from Dr. Laura Evans, who had become both a teacher and a mentor throughout the program. "This is just the beginning," she told him. "Real work happens when you apply these skills in your daily interactions with citizens." Mitchell knew she was right. The program had given him tools and insights, but it was up to him to use them consistently and effectively. He had made a commitment to himself and to his community to be a better police officer, and he intended to honor that commitment. In the months that followed, Mitchell continued to apply the lessons he had learned. He became more thoughtful in his approach to policing, more patient in his interactions with citizens, and more aware of his own biases and assumptions. He also became involved in community outreach programs, speaking at schools and community centers about police work and the importance of mutual respect and understanding. The changes in Mitchell's approach were noticed by his supervisors and colleagues. He was promoted to senior patrol officer and eventually became a training officer himself, helping new recruits understand the importance of fair and impartial policing. Mitchell also maintained his relationship with Councilwoman Harris, serving on a committee that worked to improve police-community relations. Their partnership, which had begun with conflict and misunderstanding, became a model for how law enforcement and community leaders could work together to address systemic issues. The incident that had started with a simple parking ticket had become a catalyst for change that extended far beyond Mitchell's own career. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and discrimination, but it had also given him the opportunity to become a better officer and a better person. Years later, when Mitchell told the story to new recruits, he would emphasize that the most important lesson wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them. "We all have biases," he would say. "The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge them and work to overcome them." The parking ticket that had started it all was still tucked away in Mitchell's desk drawer, a reminder of the day that had changed his life and career. It served as a symbol of the cost of assumptions and the power of accountability, a lesson that had transformed not just one officer, but an entire approach to community policing. And in the end, that transformation had made Mitchell not just a better police officer, but a better guardian of justice for all the citizens he had sworn to protect and serve.